Marsha Mori, Chair of Work Group 3. Delighted to have everyone here. We have an exciting afternoon talking about victim issues and compensation, also restorative justice. So we're really looking forward to this, two really important topics. All members of our work group are here. Our chairs, Justice Earls, Attorney General Steiner on the line. Senator Mohammed will be on shortly. He's still wrapping up a client issue. So I think we're ready to go. And I'm going to turn it over to Natalia to introduce the rest of the program. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you all. It's my honor today to introduce our first speaker, Danielle Sered. She is the Executive Director of Common Justice, a pioneer in the restorative justice movement. And she is the author of Until We Reckon, which I have right here. And it's a really, if you haven't read it, I know she's going to distill some of it today, but I know she cannot distill it all. So I hope you'll consider reading it. It was really eye-opening to me and offers a really insightful examination of how our criminal justice system often fails to provide victims the accountability that they're looking for, exacerbate cycles of violence, and she offers a pathway forward, which I'm sure she'll share some of today. So Danielle, thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. It's really my honor to be with you. And I am in Brooklyn, New York now, though I'm from Chicago, and I direct an organization called Common Justice, where we develop and advance solutions to violence that the needs of those who are harmed, advance racial equity, and don't rely on incarceration. And at the core of our work is a restorative justice-based alternative to incarceration for serious violent felonies, in which young people 16 to 24 who commit crimes like stabbings, shootings, gunpoint robberies, attempted murders, with the consent of the district attorney and the victims of their crime, enter into our violence intervention program and then a restorative justice process with the people they hurt, where they reach agreements about how to make things as right as possible. And if they fulfill those agreements and the requirements of the program, they don't go to prison, and the felony charges against them are dismissed. And in the meantime, we work with the people they hurt to help them come through what happened to them and in their lives generally. And so we started Common Justice in part out of a commitment to end mass incarceration. We understood that we would not end mass incarceration without addressing violence. That's both because more than half of people locked up in the United States are locked up for crimes of violence, but also because we know what animates the public and many elected officials and others to double down on incarceration instead of investing in schools or hospitals or roads or infrastructure or public health systems or any of those other things we need, is because of a story we've been told about who commits harm, who is hurt, and what it takes to keep one another safe. And so I thought I would frame my remarks with you today around the 4 principles at Common Justice that we believe should guide any responses to violence. And it's important for me to say that I don't necessarily come to my commitment to end mass incarceration as somebody who's solely committed to that. I come to it as a survivor, and I come to that commitment through a question of what it will take for us to end violence. And so I want to try and explain what I mean by that. The first thing we believe at Common Justice is that responses to violence should be based in accountability. I believe that when you cause harm, you incur an obligation, period. I believe even people who have been previously hurt, even people who have suffered harm themselves, all of those things, no matter what has happened, that when someone has hurt someone, we owe something for it. There is a human obligation that arises from that. And that obligation is rooted in our human agency and in our human dignity, and in all of those things that create the basis for us to transform, but also to answer for what we've done. I think we make a mistake in this country in conflating punishment and accountability. And it's my belief that not only are punishment and accountability not the same thing, that they're often antithetical. So punishment is passive. Punishment is something someone does to me. All I have to do to be punished is not escape it. Accountability is different. It's active. It requires that I acknowledge what I've done, that I acknowledge its impact, that I express genuine remorse, that I make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those I've hurt, and that I become someone who will not cause that harm ever again. The work of accountability is some of the hardest work any of us will ever do. And it has the advantage of actually transforming us into people who will not cause further harm, the advantage of actually accruing to the public safety, and of bringing great benefit to the survivors we have hurt in our actions by giving a pathway in which we provide answers to their questions, we provide forms of repair that are meaningful to them, and we repair the damage we've done as much as we possibly can. In punishment, where we are isolated, where our dignity and agency are both reduced, our capacity to engage in that process of repair is deeply, deeply reduced. And as someone who believes in accountability, I find that one of the places where accountability is most absent, hardest to cultivate, and hardest to practice is in a prison. The second thing we believe is that responses to violence should be survivor-centered. This sounds obvious. We talk all the time in survivors' names. We pass laws in their names all the time. And at the same time, we don't do a lot of actually listening to survivors about what they need. And so at the top of this call, I said that we only take people into common justice if the victims of their crimes agree. Now, it's important to remember that fewer than half of victims even call the police in the first place. Shame on us if we pretend to be a victim-centered criminal justice system. When I was in school, 50% was an F. That's where we're starting from. Another of those half who do call, another half will drop out before the grand jury process. They will decide that the disadvantages of the process outweigh the advantages, however they view those, and will divest from that process entirely. That remaining 25% is arguably the jailingest subset of victims you'll find, right? They're people who are proceeding through a process they know is likely to result in the incarceration of the person they hurt, or who hurt them. And at Common Justice, we ask those victims, people who've had guns to their heads, who have had lacerations to their liver, who have had their lives threatened and sometimes even nearly taken. We ask them, do you want the person who hurt you in common justice, or do you want them incarcerated? 90% choose common justice. 90%. It's a wild number. And when we first started experiencing that, I thought that people were better than I knew. Like I thought, I see we have somebody off mute. I thought like as humans, we were better than I knew, that we were more compassionate, that we were forgiving, that we thought, but for the grace of God go I. And what I realized was in fact something different. While that's true of some people, the vast majority of survivors made that decision for a different reason. And it's something I should have known as a survivor myself. And so as survivors, like we will feel fear so profound that even in our own homes, in the arms of the people we love most, we will be unable to fall asleep. And when we finally do fall asleep, when exhaustion takes us, we will wake from that sleep with nightmares. And we will feel loss so profound that we would like wring out our bones because it feels that it is stored in the marrow there, and we would do anything to be free of it. And we will feel rage, like so all-consuming, it makes us unrecognizable, not just to those who love us, but even to ourselves. But at the end of the day, we are pragmatic. And that doesn't mean that we don't have those emotions. It's at the end of the day, we have those emotions and we are practical too. And there are two things as survivors that we cannot stand. We cannot stand the idea of going through it again. And we cannot stand the idea of someone else going through it. And so when we are faced with a choice between two options, we will choose the option that we believe will prevent those things we cannot stand. And we will choose that even as we feel pain, as we feel fear, as we feel rage, because preventing those will be the most important thing to us at the end of the day. And for those of us who live in neighborhoods where incarceration is common, the hardest thing you can try and do is to persuade us that incarceration produces safety, because we have paid for incarceration's failure with our enduring pain. It is because incarceration has not produced communities as safe as we deserve that we were hurt in the first place, whether that is directly because the person who hurt us themselves or their family member was impacted by incarceration, or more broadly, that our system's continuous investment in incarceration instead of other ways to keep us safe has failed to produce the conditions in which we would not have been hurt. We incarcerate more people in America than any nation on the globe, any nation in human history. If incarceration produced safety, we would be the safest country ever to have existed. It is not who we are. And so as survivors, we choose other options, not necessarily because we're merciful. Sometimes our first choice would be to put a bullet in them ourselves, but our second choice would be for them to transform, right? And not necessarily because we hope that for their hearts and souls, but because we hope that for ourselves so that we will not be hurt by them. And we hope it for others so that others will not be hurt by them. And so it's my deep belief, if you listened only to survivors, if you did not care about defendants, if you did not care about their family members, if you did not care about other community members, if your only constituents, your only moral compass were victims of crime, if you listened deeply enough, you would come to the conclusion that we had to end mass incarceration in their names. And that relates to the third principle that we think should characterize all efforts to address violence, which is that they should be safety driven. That sounds obvious. You want to address violence by reducing violence, but our responses do not do this. So fundamentally, I'm not in the business of ending prison. I'm in the business of ending violence. And those of us in that business know the core drivers of violence are structural. They are inequity, their poverty, their lack of access to education, medical care, mental health care, all of those things. But on the individual level, the reason one person in the same neighborhood might cause harm when others won't, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And I would argue the core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. It means we have baked into our core response to violence exactly the things that create it. It's like showing up at a house fire with a hose full of gasoline. That is not what you do if you want to quell the flames. And we're dishonest if we act surprised when it fails. And so we have to take heed of the lessons of the research that demonstrates this over and over. The prison not only fails to produce safety, it actually produces harm. It's what researchers call criminogenic, where two similarly situated people, one who is incarcerated and one who is not, the one who is incarcerated is more likely to cause more violence in the future than the one who isn't. We owe it to our communities, we owe it to survivors, and we owe it, I believe, to the people who have caused harm for our responses to violence to be ones that will ultimately make us safe. And we know how to do this. Interventions like restorative justice produce those outcomes. We have fewer than 7% of our participants terminated for new crimes. Not to be sassy, but show me a prison that can say that. Violence interrupter programs have huge, great traction in addressing violence as it occurs and preventing retaliation. Community-based healing circles and accountability processes and all of these things have long held the responsibility of keeping communities as safe as possible. We know how to do this. We only have to choose it. And that links to the last principle, which is that we believe responses to violence should be racially equitable. They never have been in America. So when we talk about the urgent crisis of policing in America, we should be talking about a crisis we understand to be as old as the institution of policing. That we have never as a nation successfully invested in the protection and safety of Black people in particular, and people of color more generally. So when we think about becoming that nation, it does not mean us going back to a time when relationships were better. It means forging forward into a time that we have not yet known together. It means committing to repair. It means committing to listening. It means understanding that the racial disparities that affect our treatment of defendants at every stage of the process have also affected our treatment of crime victims, and that we owe something to them too. And I actually believe when we think about how we steer into that repair, I don't think the steps are actually any different than the ones that are required of us when we cause individual harm. I believe we need to acknowledge what we have done. We need to acknowledge its impact. We need to express genuine remorse. We need to make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed. And we need to become a nation that will never do it again. I know that reckoning is hard, but as somebody who does restorative justice work, I have the gift of spending my days morning to night with people who steer into the confrontation of the harm they have caused and find their way to the other side. And what I know from watching those processes over and over again is however difficult they are to enter into, not only do they always produce something of value, they always produce something even more valuable than we could imagine on this side of the truth. And so I will close there so that we have time for questions, and we can steer the conversation to wherever is of most use to you all as a task force. Thank you so much.
All right. Are there questions for Danielle? Thank you so much.
I have a question. First of all, I want to thank you so much because you just opened my eyes to some things that I was not aware of, and I'm going to buy your book, really. My question is, I know you've been doing this for quite some time. How have other states been able to, how have they been receptive or non-receptive to your statements and your look and views on incarceration?
I think we have long seen a lot of appetite for this kind of work. We have seen it from people who care about the end of mass incarceration wherever they're situated. We've seen it from crime victims. We've seen it from mayors. We've seen it from elected officials. We've seen it all over. We've seen it from corrections administrators. We've seen, like, the people who were most excited when I was talking about the planning for common justice were honestly the people I talked to at Rikers Island Jail, our jail in New York City, who was like, you're going to take these people instead of them being here with me? Good luck, God bless, because I know what we're doing isn't doing the thing that's required. The people we have not yet until recently had excited generally in this country are prosecutors. And at the ends of the day, the diversion, in order for restorative justice to actually serve as an alternative to prison, we need prosecutors to be on board. And so I am immensely encouraged by the growing trend of prosecutors campaigning on a platform that is not just about locking up the most people possible, but about producing the greatest safety and fairness possible. And when that is the measure a prosecutor uses, when a prosecutor asks him or herself at the end of the day, is the community safer because of what I did, and was what I did fair? Then we necessarily become people who look for these kinds of solutions. If a prosecutor asks, did I get the most possible convictions for the longest possible time, they're not going to be calling us. Like, we know that that's true. But the prosecutor says, at the end of the day, I have to look into the eyes of every mother who loses her child in my jurisdiction. And I have to say to that mother that I stand by all the decisions I made that created the conditions in which her child lived and ultimately lost his life. Like, I think about that as like the grieving mother's test. It's my test for myself in our work. When we take someone into the program, am I ready to say, if I take a risk on this person and this person causes harm, can I look at the mother of the person who is hurt and in good faith say we did everything we could and that we exercised sound judgment? And so I think as we see a shift, and I don't think this is actually, I don't like calling it progressive prosecutors, because I don't think it's a Republican or Democrat question. And I don't think it's actually a progressive or conservative question. I think values like accountability and centering victims can be considered very conservative values. I think it's a question about whether the measure is convictions or the measure is safety, where the measure is sentencing length or the measure is fairness. And I think when we shift our measures, it will push us to shift our practices. And I think we're seeing that all over the country, certainly in the people campaigning on progressive platforms, but also increasingly in people campaigning still on conservative platforms, but ones that value the outcomes of their choices.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Angelica Wendt. If y'all haven't seen me typically in this work group, because I belong to work group 2, but I've been doing anti-violence work for a very long time. And I have to say, and you know, most recently or the longest is the anti-sexual violence and human trafficking work. And one of the things that I've seen is, you know, I was commenting to someone that when we talk about victims and what we hear, and I really appreciate that you said centering the survivors or victims. And so I'm curious, So who initiates the process? Like, what does that look like? Is it like DA initiated? Is it victim initiated, or is it?
It can be initiated by anybody. Like, so the DA can initiate it, a defense attorney can make a referral, a survivor can call us directly, a judge can flag a case, a community member can, someone from another program can bring it to our attention. And then our first step is to secure the approval of the DA to move forward. Our second step is to secure the consent of the survivor. And our third step is to conduct an intake and assessment with the person responsible for harm. It happens in that order, both because we're survivor centered, but also because if the survivor says no, we just say that we said no. And so it means that the person responsible for that harm is not aware that the survivor had this yes, no decision and made it in any way. They only become aware of that decision if the answer is affirmative.
Oh, great. Yeah, because I often wonder, because I've seen like other places where they try to implement this, and it's really like DA initiated, and
Yeah.
then the DA is presenting this option to a survivor who says, look, we don't have a case,
Yeah.
take this, you know,
Yeah.
and survive it. And so that's why I was wondering, and I have to echo your sentiments about the piece about the survivor or the victim experience in a sense. What I've seen in the work that I've done is and really been looking for it, not like restorative justice, but also transformative justice, with this understanding that people that are harmed, like there is no good or bad. People hurt other people and commit crimes or do things, but it doesn't mean that there are bad people and that there's a history behind it, that if you tend to look back at that perpetrator or defendant, you will note that they've got their own story of their own victimization. And so I say all that is because in my work with victims, survivors, is that in essence, that's what it is. Survivors mainly say, I just don't want them to do what they did to me to someone else. It's not necessarily always incarceration. It's more of, I don't want anybody else to get hurt. And I also want them to admit that they caused me harm.
That's right.
And sometimes survivors, what I've seen is that they've said, I just want that person to say, yes, I caused you harm and I'm sorry.
That's
And
right.
I've seen like criminal justice response where the survivor has been taken out completely out of the process, and there's been an actual prosecution. And well, first of all, we work with survivors and say, listen, a prosecution isn't going to bring you healing necessarily, or a conviction, right? It's a sliver of this larger pie that, you know, that you can work towards your healing. And part of it, and what I've seen is that oftentimes victims, when there's actually been a prosecution or a conviction, and the victim has been cut out of the whole process, but there's a conviction, and then we've heard from victims that say, I've just been re-victimized by the system again.
Yep.
Right. And that's why I tell people, like, equal access to a broken system isn't equity. And the reality is the system that we currently have, I mean, it's what we have, and it's all, we'd be remiss not to acknowledge that it's also a system that doesn't really take into account like the victim. When you think about the lens of penalties, or when the best way I can say it is, in North Carolina, you know, when someone commits a crime, the victim is the state of North Carolina, right? And the victim, the one that actually was injured, is like the victim witness, right? And I think just even premised on that, I think sets the tone for this larger system where the injured party is more peripheral to the whole piece, and that only creates at times harm to the victims. And so the fact that there's this more and more conversations on restorative justice and creating alternatives to the criminal justice system is really exciting, and I think long overdue.
Thank you for every bit. I just echo every bit of it. I think your point that people who have caused harm are also survivors. I've met thousands of people in prisons and jails over the years. I've yet to meet one who isn't a survivor. And so it's interesting for us to ask ourselves, if you said to us, you know, what do you do to people who commit harm, or like we put them in prison, and you say, what do you do to survivors who express their pain in part by passing it on to others. And you're like, oh, we put them in cages, right? It sounds different. That doesn't excuse what they did, because I don't believe what we should do is excuse it. I believe what we should do is accountability. I believe what we should do is hold people to the requirement of repair, which is different than holding people to the requirement of degradation, right? I think the second part that you speak to is that victims very often perceive themselves to be only instrumental in the criminal justice process, only of value if they can help somebody secure a conviction, and then sometimes of value to a defense attorney if the defense attorney finds out they don't want one, but never of value in their own right. And that's not exactly the criminal justice system's fault. It's not meant to be a healing tool, but it means the criminal justice system at the very least has to stop pretending that it is a healing tool, pretending that prosecutors are sort of like the lawyers for victims, which is conveyed subtly in a lot of ways. And at least being honest that like the state is representing the state's interest, which is not identical to the victim's interest. Like one of the ways I've compared it is that, you know, if somebody burned down your house, all our criminal justice system can do is burn down that person's house. And what the person whose house was burned down wants is somewhere to live. And we're like, what would it mean for us to envision a criminal justice system that gave them somewhere to live? And what would it mean to envision a way in which the person who burned down their house had both an obligation and a role in building the home where they could thrive again? And I think one of the things you raised that's so important when you're like, they want an apology, but they also want to ask why. Like, why me? Was it something I did? Like, did you think I was going to ABC? Was that a real gun? What would you have done if I had fought back? What would you have done if I didn't fight back? How dare you? Do you know the effects it had on my children? Like, who the blank do you think you are? All of those things. Victims want to be heard and they want answers, and no one has those answers more than the people who harmed them. And so we assume that all somebody responsible for harm can do is cause more harm. And the truth is they have elements that can be key contributors to somebody's repair that nobody else has. And if we can structure processes in which they can make those offerings in a way that is safe to that survivor, in a way that doesn't cause that survivor further harm, then those offerings can be catalytic in that person's healing. It can accelerate the healing process in ways very few other things can. And so it's our belief that when we have at our hands an intervention that is what a survivor wants, that can deliver them from their pain, and that does not put anyone else at risk of further harm, and even more so, actually decreases the likelihood that others will be at risk, we believe we have a moral obligation to make that option available to a survivor. Like, politics be damned. We have a moral obligation to make that option available to that survivor if it will better advance their healing, if it will not hurt anybody else, and if it has the additional benefit of increasing overall public safety.
I'll just add one more thing. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'll add one more thing. The piece, especially if we're talking about people of color. And I mean, the reality is a lot of survivors who are, you know, people of color, they choose not to engage in a system that has caused harm in their communities. And I can only speak in regards to like sexual violence, but what I see is that we know most of the time that the perpetrator is someone that the victim knows, and that oftentimes that perpetrator belongs in that small community that victim belongs to. And knowing that what the stats tell us, that 1 out of 4 cases are prosecuted in North Carolina for sexual assault, is that they'll go back to those communities, right? And that's what I'm saying. The victims mainly want to be able to, for that perpetrator not to do it again, and also to acknowledge the harm that they've done and do some form of repair that does not involve prison.
Yeah. Thank you.
We're going to have more times for questioning, but Natalia, do you want to go ahead and introduce our second speaker?
Yes, and thank you so much, Danielle, for your time and your wisdom today.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Mai Fernandez, who is currently a senior fellow with the Justice Policy Institute and has spent her career advocating on behalf of victims, including as a former prosecutor. So Mai, we will turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Mai, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. So just thank you very much for having me here today. And I hope that I can be of assistance to you all. And I've got to say, it's happened to me before, but speaking after Danielle is really hard because she is such a beautiful speaker and also hits on so many points that I would hit also. So I'm going to try to put a slightly different lens, but knowing that most of everything that Danielle said is something that I agree with, and that common justice has really broken great grounds in looking at how we could have a different criminal justice system. So, you know, as was mentioned, I was a former prosecutor in Manhattan, and also then went on and much later in my career to be the executive director of the National Center for Victims of Crime. But I think the position that I have held that has given me most insight into victim needs, community needs, and sort of the inequities in our system was that I led a community-based organization that served Black and Latino youth. In serving them and getting to know them and being intimate, not intimate, but really getting to know them, one of the things that became clear is that the majority of the youth that came through our center were victims of crime. Many of them were sexually abused. Others were, you know, assaulted through gang membership, but they were all very much victims of crime. And then many of them got into trouble through the criminal justice system. So this sort of false dichotomy that we've had of here are victims and here are people who do harm, as Danielle's and others have said, is completely false. The majority of the young people I was engaged with were both victims of crime and also had perpetrated crime themselves. So when I went to take the job at the National Center for Victims of Crime as their executive director, I was really kind of surprised that the field really did break up people into victims and those who do harm. Also, there was a victims movement and a criminal justice reform movement, and there didn't seem to be any kind of intertwining there. I think that what I have learned since my experience at the the community-based organization that I worked with was that how much trauma and the trauma that the young people that I was working with had undergone was an impetus for them really entering into a world of crime, or at least perpetrating crime in certain instances. The trauma they experience, either sexual abuse or child abuse or gang assault, led them to sometimes have mental health issues or have substance abuse issues. And that those feelings of either, you know, needing to find a drug or get a drug because they wanted to quell sort of the demons from inside caused them to get involved in the drug world. You know, others were angry because they had been hurt and nobody knew about it. They kept it within themselves. And so their ways of dealing with that was through violence. You know, others would, you know, they were assaulted in one relationship and then ended up in other bad relationships that ended them into the criminal justice system because of their relationships with their abusers. So it was that connection between sort of their trauma and how they ended up being involved in the criminal justice system that still is, I think, needs to be much more recognized. If 90% of the people in our jails and prisons now have been victims of crime, why aren't we addressing that issue? Why aren't we trying to figure out how if we could address the victimization issue, we might actually stop the further perpetration of a crime. I also want to put the caveat that all crime victims do not perpetrate crime, but there is a correlation between the two. So with my time at the National Center for Victims of Crime, I tried to look at what kinds of services are needed within our jail and prison systems to actually deal with the victimization and the trauma that was created, whether that be, groups or direct counseling, but really trying to hit upon those issues. And just like we provide services for somebody that might have a drug addiction or a mental health problem in jail, or they need a pair of glasses, or they have a heart arrhythmia to deal with their victimization. It's the most prevalent, common thing amongst people in jails and prisons. So what is it that can help them while they're there so that you can ease some of that trauma and they can go back into society that much better? So the question about what are the services that need to be provided in our jails and prisons, the other issue is when individuals are in the community, how is it that they receive services? Oftentimes, in underserved communities, people don't trust the police. They don't trust, sort of traditional organizations. So how do you create sort of messengers or people who sort of trusted messengers that can spread the news to individuals in the community that there are services available and that they should take advantage of them and that they should feel comfortable going to those kinds of places? Because all too often, the victims of crimes in underserved communities won't go seek assistance. Very often not to the police department, and very often up into other services that might not be available. So how do you create those messengers that the community can feel safe talking to, and also then creating those bridges between the services that exist and the communities that are underserved? So that's another focus that I've tried to look at through my work. And then I think that the other piece of this issue that I've talked to is around creating policies or procedures or new ways of doing things, particularly when it comes to criminal justice reform. Victims are left out of those conversations. They are not included in those policies because they think, oh, victims need something and criminal justice reform is something else. So again, that dichotomy that's been created. So how do you include victims in any changes that you are all considering? So it's about explaining the changes, is bringing together the victim community, both sort of the traditional victim service organizations that are out there, but also some of those underserved victims and victims that have criminal justice backgrounds. How do you bring those constituencies together and explain the changes that you're thinking about making, and including their opinions and really listening to their concerns? So again, it's something that's not being done to them, but it's something that they are creating also. So as much as Danielle focuses on how to change the system, I also would think that you should think about how to provide comprehensive services to victims, both in jails and in the communities, in order to deal with the trauma that they've experienced. But also, as you begin to think about changes or policies or procedures, how to include victim constituencies of all types into your policy and change discussions. So happy to answer any questions. Like I said, I thought that Danielle covered a lot of information that I was going to cover, and was just trying to draw some distinctions about creating really robust services in places, and also including victims in any policy changes.
Thank you, Mai. Questions or comments?
Really appreciate both of these presentations. It gives us a lot to think about. And, you know, I'm trying to go more into the brass tacks. What's needed, especially in our prisons or our jails, to start this restorative process, to start victims' voices being heard? When is it the optimum time to do it? Is it at charging? Can it be years later after someone has spent years in prison? I mean, I guess there is no timeline, but what are optimum examples or places we could go to really see where the best bang for your buck is to put these resources in for victims to be heard? And I would say North Carolina, we just passed a constitutional amendment called Marcy's Law. And it was to guarantee the constitutional protections to victims, their right to be heard at trial, the right to be notified of every single hearing. And it really emboldened them as an arm of the prosecutor to speak out about their crime. And I don't know if we focused enough in on the restorative part of it. And if you have any suggestions or that, or states that have great examples for us to look to, any of your thoughts? Thank you.
I think in many ways it's new ground. I think that it would be as easy as it's not as easy, but it would need to be a sophisticated screening tool. Just like if we have to find out that somebody needs insulin for diabetes because they have diabetes, or they have a drug problem, so we need to give them drug treatment, there should be a screening for victimization, and that should be early on. And so that when you're creating sort of a plan for that individual, you can start integrating services that make sense. And look, different kinds of victimizations sometimes need different kinds of service. If you've been the victim of identity theft, that's going to be very different than what your needs are as a victim of sexual assault. So it's also distinguishing the kind of crime and then trying to find how you can tailor specific services. But I think the first step is finding out what it is, the trauma that happened to these individuals. And it's usually not a one-time shot. It's not like they were sexually abused once. It's probably that they've been sexually abused throughout their life, or that they have then been victims of domestic violence, and then that led them into other problems and other issues. But I think that those things, like I said, you're not going to find out. You don't want to find out that somebody has diabetes 2 years into their sentence. You want to know that up front so you can start dealing with it right away.
And if I could just follow up briefly, and it sounds like really concentrating a lot in the education in the prosecutor's office. And I'm also thinking parole boards to look more into restorative justice, if that's wanted by a victim. That there are a lot of entry points to start this, either at the early end or the late stage or the middle stage of where we are.
I mean, I don't always know if the prosecutor's office is the right point, but it could be in pretrial. So pretrial services, trying to find some of this stuff out. Jail admissions could be another point where you're going to ferret out some of this information. I think the prosecutor with regards to restorative justice makes sense, but the actual service provision to deal with the trauma, I think is better set with pretrial or with jail admissions and then prison admissions.
Hi, this is Henderson, interloping from Working Group 4. But I did want to, sort of sign off to what Mai just said about whether the prosecutor is the appropriate placement for these services, and to urge that we find some other provider that's not central to the adversarial process that goes on in the courthouse. And I know from Danielle's experience in New York, being able to work at that end with the Brooklyn DA at the start was critically important. And I do believe the prosecutors have a critically important role. I just think it's also essential that we split off and give the harmed party an independent voice and center of advocacy for their own recovery and restoration. The one interloping point I would have is something that Representative Morey actually touched on, is that this process can begin at the beginning of the criminal justice system or towards the end. And my own interest has been with the Second Look Act, and many of the same critical features, involvement of the harmed parties, actual determination of where genuine remorse can be shown. The victims that I've been in contact highly prize genuine expressions of remorse, highly prize evidence of a life of redemption. And one of the benefits that a Second Look Act gives is a history of what they've done post-crime, and providing a mechanism to give the harmed party that essential information. I think it's important.
I think it's funny that you bring up that example, because I got a call one day and they said, and it was here in Washington, D.C., and they said, we're looking at this act. What do you think about it? How do you think victims are going to feel about it? And I said, why don't you go and ask victims? Yeah. Because I am one person, I can kind of tell you what I think, but I think you need to present this to a set of victim advocates, and also to bring certain victims in. But it's, it's so rare that consideration is made. And yet it is center to creating policy like this or legislation like this.
Yeah, let me just take one other opportunity to comment. One of the things that came up in the conversation with the victim that reached out in response to a working group meeting was that she felt a part of the prosecution team and thought that adjustments that the Second Look Act would make that would be different than the sentencing that was imposed, that was a breach of a promise to her and to her family, and a breach to the work that had been done by her team. And right. There's been this loyalty because the prosecution had advocated for them. That she was actually trying to protect, the work product of the prosecution. And for me, that just sort of highlighted the need to separate out what the genuine needs and actually desires of the harmed party are. What makes them strong? What makes them healthier? And it was very much, I think, like what Danielle was talking about, hearing acceptance of responsibility, accountability, and some growth, remorse and redemption. So thank you, Mai. It was incredibly helpful insights.
No, Absolutely. Love talking to you guys.
Other questions or comments?
Karen, we're bleeding a little bit into the discussion period, so I thought I might, as it sounds like some ideas are already kind of percolating for the group, but I thought I might share my screen and put a couple of the starting ideas on the screen that we had talked about. So I'll do that briefly, and then we can get back to discussion. Can you see that?
Yes.
So these are just two ideas strictly related to restorative justice: establish and fund community restorative justice programs across the state, and establish and fund restorative justice programs in correctional facilities and jails. And I'll stop the share now, and we can start it back when we're ready to move on to the victim compensation fund ideas.
Jasmine, I think those are great recommendations. I mean, I think restorative justice is so important, especially starting in juvenile court. I mean, you know, the whole premise kind of teen courts, or having kids understand each other and interview what happened, why, and have the empathy. So, I mean, I think your two proposals are good. I don't know if we need to further, you know, flesh them out, but
I think that the comment I would make is the common justice experience demonstrated how important community was. And in a city as large as New York, you know, they took on one borough at the beginning, worked with the community in Brooklyn. And, you know, that was an awesome undertaking. And, you know, when I look at our map with 100 counties and the diversity in the country, when we say to fund statewide, you know, how we go about figuring that out as a recommendation might.
I'm sorry, Henderson, I just want to clarify. I don't think it meant statewide. I mean, that'd be a statewide program, but that across the state, we have these programs, but not that they be statewide based. Just to clarify, that was the language was a little bit unclear.
Yeah, just because as I look at the state, I can imagine there are identifiable communities where this could be, you know, where programs could be initiated either at the beginning of the process or towards the end of the process. And thank you for that clarification, Jasmine. So.
And I don't want to speak for Danielle, but my understanding is that common justice, you know, the way they set things up, it's really for the adult system. It is not for the juvenile justice system. There's great programs to deal with juveniles, but you also, it's not, restorative justice is a broad, it's a broad term that, you know, there's lots of ways to bring it forward, and it depends on your population.
So as Jasmine said, this is a time for this particular working group to talk about recommendations. And so really want to open it up to the working group to kind of talk a little bit about either a response to what Jasmine has said. Representative Moore, you had said that you really thought that those were good, but really wanted to open it up to the rest of the task group, the task force working group, the working group for some reactions.
Yeah, this is Jim Woodall. I would, a couple of things on the restorative justice side. I think it's important to look at that at different stages because, you know, in my district, one of the things we've tried to do is actually exactly what Henderson just talked about. We try to make victims as often as we can part of the team. When we go in, I'm fortunate I can count about a dozen former victims in my district who I consider now to be very good friends, people I socialize with, I go out and eat with, and those kinds of things, because we try our best and we don't always achieve it to embrace them. But what I've found is the restorative justice discussion, depending on the crime, especially extremely violent crimes, can be very difficult and really hard for the prosecutor to get into with certain victims. Sometimes we run the risk of almost alienating them with that initial conversation. So I think it's important that the restorative justice piece, that we look at that, and perhaps in the prosecutor's office is a good place to start, but I think there are some other places where that can come in. It doesn't have to be at the beginning, because it can be a difficult conversation whenever emotions are so raw early in the process. And early in the process, in days or weeks, sometimes it's not even years. It can be a long time for some people.
Oh, go ahead.
So Karen, appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. So I can tell you from personal experiences in private warrant courtrooms, and like Danielle mentioned, a number of victims, oftentimes they just want defendants to acknowledge their mistakes and figure out how to wrong their rights. So I think Jasmine's recommendations are great. I think the biggest emphasis needs to be on funding these restorative justice programs to help folks, and encouraging as much as possible to make sure that prosecutors' offices are looking at it. So I support the recommendations.
Angelica, did you have a comment?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on that. One is the piece about encouraging funding. I think that that's really important, obviously she's not here for me to ask for follow-up, but I think it's important that, you had Common Justice, who is completely, it's a different entity. It's not the DA's office trying to administer or offer this. And so for me, it almost makes you wonder whether it might be more survivor-centered just to offer it as an option at the beginning, especially when someone has been impacted by a crime. Again, the victim witness coordinator, with I'm just using actual police department, will send them a list of resources. And I'm wondering if it's a possibility of just offering restorative justice as also another option. Right, because sometimes you have survivors that started to go with the system, and then they recognize that maybe that response isn't right for them, and then they won't move forward. But the other piece is that time, sometimes even when you have survivors that want to go forward and are prepared, because one of the things that we really try to do is have some transparency of what the experience is going to look like. So if you have a survivor that says, yes, I want to move forward and be engaged with the criminal justice system, we will say, we'll be right with you. We'll be right standing with you every step of the way. And we also think that we need to have a conversation of what that could look like. It's not going to look like a charge has been done, the guys or the person's been arrested, and then like 3 months later, there's been a trial, or, he pleads guilty or whatnot. We're talking about years that a survivor has to be waiting for their day in court. And oftentimes survivors just want closure, that in fact, a lot of times survivors who, especially on sexual assault cases, by the time their case gets around, it's just reopening that wound again. And so if we were able to offer the option of a restorative justice process at the beginning, I think that might be helpful, and offer it at some other point as well, not just focus it at one you're done if you didn't choose it at this point. The other thing I would suggest, just because here, is the importance of victim voices in processes. And I would just offer that perhaps the formation of a sub-work group that is consisting of victims and victim advocates, just to be able to offer some feedback in terms of what recommendations that impact them are being offered. I think it would be helpful, because victims are not a monolith. And so I'm only speaking from my experience, but I'm sure that there are victims out there that also want to be engaged in the criminal justice system and want the person to be incarcerated and all that. So I think that the more that we can incorporate victim voices in recommendations, the stronger the recommendations are.
Yeah. I just want to say something. You brought up, victims do want closure. And one of the things that happens, closure does not occur after a trial or after a plea. We have appeals, we have motions for appropriate relief. Literally this past week, I was on the phone with a sexual assault victim from almost 20 years ago, informing her that a motion for appropriate relief had been filed. She lives now in the state of Washington. She said, if the judge grants a hearing, I will be there at my own expense. And we re-victimize victims in the criminal justice system over and over again. And so I just want to let everybody know, don't think that because a plea gets entered or a trial ends, that victim, not only in their day-to-day life, but in the criminal justice system, that we don't come back years later and put them on trial again, because it happens. I have a small district, but no more than a couple of weeks go by that I'm not calling, and I make the phone calls in my district. I make the phone call to let a victim know someone's attempting to reopen this case through an MAR or whatever method it might be, just to let you know. And if we need you, we will certainly contact you, but I feel like I'm compelled to let them know when these things come up. So I just want to point out that they get victimized over and over again in our system.
Jim, I think that's a good point, and I know that occurs, but I think it also goes back to what, the earlier steps closer to the time of the offense. If victims want healing, if they want understanding why this happened, if they want to ensure they will never be violated again and no one else will be. So it sounds like that's where a lot of energy should focus. So you don't get 20 years down the road and have a, person that's gone through it and be re-victimized because they didn't have the opportunity to do restorative justice from day one.
I agree with that. But one of the things you can never guarantee them that it's not going to happen again, or it's not going to happen to somebody else. That's one thing you cannot do in the work that we do. And I think one of the things that comes up that I think is so difficult is when to have that conversation. We actually let our victims know about the restorative justice process. We let them know very early on, but I would say virtually almost all the time, they ask us what it is and to explain it to them. I agree it needs to be done early on, but it's got to be something really robust. And, we have one of the first dispute settlement centers in the country in my district in Carborough. They do restorative justice. They probably do it as well as anyone anywhere does it. And it is still a really difficult conversation, and timing that conversation is a challenge. I will tell you that from 31 years of experience with it. And I'm talking about really serious crimes here. I'm not talking about, minor offenses. I'm talking about sexual assaults, serious physical assaults, those kinds of things, home invasions, that type of thing.
Representative Maury, I wanted to clarify that those two were just starting points. And so if based on the conversation, there's additional fleshing out that Natalia and I can do to bring back specific language based on what we're hearing, we're happy to do that as well.
I think Jasmine, that'd be great if you all can do that to help.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think a part of it also could be the parole hearing issue. I know 60 Minutes did a restorative justice years ago, but it was about a murder, and it was about the family of the victim coming to meet with the defendant who had been in prison for decades. And it was a lot of work. It's not like a one-time 30-minute what happened. It's a continuous process that went on for months, but really changed the lives on both ends of the person who had been in prison, convicted, and also the victim's family, and went to a parole hearing and there was a release. And it was a phenomenal story, but you know, this is another tool in the toolbox. We are looking at mass incarceration. We are looking at racial inequities. And I think we're presenting this information by experts that this is one tool that, you know, might help reconcile things. So.
All right, Natalia, we have another speaker.
So I think we're going to shift the latter portion of this into a discussion more specifically on victim compensation issues. And so Jasmine is going to kind of walk us through some of what she has worked on and learned about in that area. And I know we have a couple guests who can also aid us in the discussion. But I'll let Jasmine kind of walk us through some of those ideas.
I'm muted. I'll try that again. These are some ideas that we have heard from various stakeholders. They are also ideas that have been proposed in other states. Don't worry as much about the specific language of the statute. As we've talked about before, the task force may not want to propose specific language, but I can just kind of give you a high level of what the concepts are. The concept with this slide is just to include for North Carolina's Victim Compensation Fund conduct that would be related to improper use of force by law enforcement, and recognizing those people as victims of crime, regardless of what happens in the criminal justice process. Show this one. This is another one that we have heard has impact from victim advocates from an equity perspective. It's related to the ability of the board to deny victim compensation based on any involvement of the victim by the crime. And the idea there is just related to sort of putting, as we heard earlier, putting people into boxes of you know, sort of perpetrator or victim when sometimes it can be a little more messy. Similarly, this one is related to prohibiting the board from denying an application based on the victim's failure to cooperate, for similar reasons in terms of all victims not choosing to engage in the traditional criminal justice system. This is a similar concept. It's related to what is in a police report and whether somebody was ultimately charged with a crime. And this is more detail about that, providing additional ways that evidence, and I know this is a lot of information, so don't worry about the details of what it says. Again, the concept here is that there are more ways to sort of provide evidence of someone's victimization so that they are not automatically eliminated based on ways that they are currently eliminated now. And then finally, you have already in one of your early recommendations recommended racial equity training for court system actors. An additional idea that came up through our research and conversations was racial equity training for crime victim compensation commission members and staff, because they are also an important stakeholder in this process as we consider victim equity. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Again, these were just ideas to start the conversation. And we invited Angelica, as well as Monica Johnston-Hostler, who is executive director for NC, for the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, to participate in this conversation. And they can answer questions for you know, the kinds of challenges they see on the ground for victims and working with victim compensation, but also victim equity issues more generally. So thanks to Monica, and Angelica has already been here participating as well. So I'll stop there.
And Jasmine, maybe you or Monica or someone could talk a little bit more of just the background of like the big picture of what type of what is the victim compensation fund? What's accessible to people in the current system?
Sure. So I'll give it a shot, and then Monica, feel free to jump in. The Victim Compensation Fund is, as you saw with all of those large statutory provisions, a statutorily created fund. It's housed within the Department of Public Safety and their Victim Services unit. It is, a finite resource. There are a number of restrictions, statutorily created restrictions, in terms of when the crime had to occur and what engagement the victim had to have in law enforcement, and many conversations with Monica and others, and she can speak for herself, we have seen certain types of barriers that happen again and again, and a lot of them happen in a racially inequitable way. So that's the context for where those specific ideas were coming from. Monica?
I think you described it very well. The only thing that I would add is crime victims compensation is a part of a federal formula program, and North Carolina also provides a match to that. And so a lot of the concerns that we have, some states have already addressed, and I know Jasmine's team has looked at a couple of those states who've started to move the needle. So while there's clearly some federal guidance, there's a lot of leeway for states to really look at ways in which to make this more accessible to all crime victims and to remove some of the, what we would consider racial inequities or implicit biases that we see in the way that the crime victims compensation is actually distributed in our state.
Obviously, I haven't been part of this working group, but I just wanted to reiterate, and I just want to piggyback with the realities, and when we talk about victims of crime, especially, and I'm just going to talk about more like the immigrant victim of crime, and what we see, especially the undocumented immigrant of crime. What we find is they often, people who are undocumented often get targeted because they know that they will not call the police, and they know that they will not file a police report, and yet they have no access to the Victims Compensation Fund because they don't have a police report. In the same way with survivors of sexual assault, because the state of North Carolina has made a lot of great leeways in the sense of the victim response to survivors of sexual assault, and yet at the same time that there are a lot of survivors of sexual assault, they will not call the police or want to file a police report because of what they see in the news, or their friend had an experience where they were victimized, and so they don't want to experience the same thing with the criminal justice system, so they choose not to get involved at all. And all these other complexities that I think that we've already talked about before, of what does it mean to call the police or engage in the criminal justice system, where it has done a lot of harm to people of color. And so having said that, if I would advocate for a rewriting where it's not, you having access to victims compensation isn't premised on you filing a police report. If there are other ways that you can show that you've been a victim of crime. I'll give you an example. If you're an undocumented immigrant woman who shows up at the hospital, get a forensic kit done, but to make it into not file a police report, but have an anonymous kit done. In theory, because law enforcement wasn't involved and they didn't file a police report, then they don't have access to the Victim Compensation Fund, right? So just trying to figure out different ways to have access to it that doesn't require the police report.
I agree with Angelica. I would say that's probably one of the biggest concerns for survivors of color. The other piece that I would say is the mere definition that the survivor, and this is across the board, and we certainly see it in our immigrant communities, but I would say we see it in all of our marginalized communities, that victim cannot also have been committed a crime. So one of the things that we see most often is, especially survivors of sexual violence or any intimate partner violence, are often required or coerced to commit a crime by their perpetrator, which then furthers their inability to be eligible for crime victims compensation. And so we certainly argued this to the General Assembly several years ago, especially around our young adult survivors of sexual assault. One of the biggest reviews when we looked at the Crime Victims Compensation Review Panel was there was almost unanimously denial of a young survivor of sexual assault of color who either was underage drinking or engaged in marijuana. Those were like the top two reasons that we saw survivors of color who were young be denied crime victims compensation. And so for me, that's a huge gap in, and you all have talked about that, right? The re-victimization of a victim, that doesn't mean that their sexual assault was less important because they were underage drinking or because they were smoking marijuana. Those are not things that cause people to commit sexual harm. And so really being very clear that when we talk about the requirements to receive crime victims compensation, it is certainly one of the mechanisms that we see victims often continuously re-victimize through a system. I saw one of Jasmine's recommendations, and this is another group, is I also believe that, you know, these are stakeholders and system actors who should be required to have implicit bias training. There is a panel that makes the decision about who receives crime victims compensation support. I also have a list of things that survivors of color should have access to. We generally see the fund go to pay for things if they do, approve the request for compensation, is they will pay for hospital or maybe therapy. But when we look at poor marginalized communities, there's also things like how do we pay for childcare if they have to go to court? And so organizations like mine, and there are other victim advocacy organizations who try to fill the gap, but this funding is allowable for those type of costs that we often see as cost burdens for survivors of color, marginalized communities who may not come forward because they don't have the resources to go through the process. And so I think that's the other place for me, is including this group as a group of system actors who are trained and receive the training that Jasmine mentioned in her recommendation.
Can I add something else, Monica? Because you just, I was like, oh, this is the other one. The other piece is I was looking at who comprises the commission that makes the determination of whether a victim compensation application gets approved or not. And I don't see anywhere where there's like a requirement. For me, I would advocate that at least half of the commission members either are either victim advocates or have a background in working with victims one way or another, because victimization is really complex, right? And that's why it makes it so difficult to come with like a one solution for everything, because it's complex. And so I would advocate that the folks that are making these decisions do have some kind of background on victimization, and because again, victimization is complex. You know, the piece of what you just said, sometimes you have victims that have been made to commit crimes by the abuser or, you know, perpetrator. And just, I would hate that decisions be made without having that lens or background. And again, I'm speaking from a place that I'm not necessarily 100% who the current members are or what background that they have, but I would certainly advocate for at least half of them to be having some type of victim background, like victim advocacy background.
Thank you for saying that, because that's always my last point. I think I've advocated to everybody around who's appointed to that compensation board. I will say that a large majority of them were either in the criminal legal system in some way, shape, or form, or they are victims. But what I will tell you is, in my tenure of working through that office, is they've never had anyone who really understands the complexities of sexual violence. And especially, I will tell you that listening to you all made me really happy. I've never heard so many people speak eloquently and understanding the complexities of the way in which sexual violence shows up and the way that it impacts survivors. That's not been true in my tenure of working with the Crime Victims Compensation Fund. Their primary victimization of focus, and we can go back and look at the trend. I haven't looked at it in several years, and rightfully so, but they've denied primarily any sexual assault survivors unless we had clear, compelling, convincing, like physical harm or near death or homicide. It really requires a sexual assault victim to have what, in their opinions, have met the top of a crime list. And so most often you'll see them put the money towards surviving families and homicide survivors. However, I believe all survivors, especially in this complexity, sexual assault, just like race, comes with so many judgments attached to who people believe is a victim, and who deserves to be a victim is attached to the implicit biases in the actual approval of the compensation request.
Right. So we still have just a few more minutes, but before you talk about next steps, I really wanted to again, ask members of this working group, what are your feelings or thinking about recommendations, or if you have other comments.
I think we need more data. I would like to see how much federal fund comes in, how much is the state matching, the number of approvals, the number of denials, the racial demographics of who's denied or who's approved, what types of crimes. As a judge, I had many cases that victim families had asked for burial expenses, victims' compensation. They couldn't even get a burial expense because there was a prior conviction for the deceased. It was outrageous. But I think this does need a good, thorough look at what's broken in our current victim compensation procedures and commission, what can be fixed, and how do we enhance it to make sure there's racial equity in it.
I appreciate hearing you say that, Representative.
Absolutely. And also part of the conversation is what happens to the victims who don't file a police report or feel comfortable calling the police? It doesn't make them any less victims. And where are there opportunities for us to create a different response to that as it relates to victims' compensation?
Yeah. And you bring up a really good point, Angelica. I mean, and I should have brought it up when you first said this. So when we created the statute that allows a victim of sexual or domestic violence to break their tenant lease, we actually didn't require a police report, and that took about 2 legislative sessions to get through. But it largely was for that reason, Angelica, because we didn't want victims to have to prove that they were going to law enforcement, which your work group and committee exist, because we know that there are racial injustices in the system. And so this isn't new that we see victims of color not using the criminal legal system as a way to move throughout to seek justice for themselves. And so we have created alternatives in the law, such as a hospital report or a verification from a local rape crisis or domestic violence shelter. We also see those are certifications that are also allowed with federal UNT visas, is you don't actually have to have a criminal report for certification. So there is both some state and federal precedents to look at other ways to qualify a victim for compensation.
I have a rather specific question, but want to take advantage of Monica and Angelica's wisdom. I'm on the Human Trafficking Legislative Commission, Legislative Advisory Commission, and we ran into sort of a difficult wall of, we received presentations from prosecutors about different changes to the statute they need to be able to go after Johns and traffickers. But there's a pushback about, increasing criminalization and whether or not that has a racial disparity from some of the members, but then also the advocates for individuals who've been trafficked acknowledge that without there being a criminal penalty for Johns and for traffickers, they never really feel peace. They never feel truly healed. So we've been kind of going in circles in terms of how we balance both the response on for the individuals who are trafficking, but also not, creating more and more laws and criminalizing more that may end up ultimately having being enforced in a racially disparate way.
I certainly will defer to Angelica. She's still on the commission, to her opinion. I have lots of opinions.
I think that part of the conversation, and Jasmine, you were part of that conversation as well, so feel free to chime in. But I think part of that conversation was, is there a different way that we can approach the solution of human trafficking? That, I mean, and not that, again, I just want to be very clear. It's not as though I don't think that the criminal justice system doesn't have its place, because it does, right? And I can, so I feel like there's multiple pieces here, but I will tell you one piece is that there's my several years working with victims of crime, what I have found is that sometimes you have victims who tie in their trauma healing to whether someone's been arrested or whether somebody has been convicted. And what we find is that that isn't the case. Like, the healing really comes within, right? That's not to say that there shouldn't be an acknowledgement about a wrong, and that there shouldn't be options for repair, and that the criminal justice shouldn't be involved. But for us as a victim service agency, what we do is really focus on, yes, the criminal response is just one piece of the larger pie of healing, right? So I want to make sure that I say that because healing is much more complex than just this person's been convicted or this person's been arrested. Now I'm emotionally healed, because that's not really realistic. And in terms of the conversation was really of how do we look to address the issue without knowing. Again, I think I made the statement earlier in the meeting about equal access to a broken system isn't equity. And I say that is because we have to acknowledge that the criminal justice system right now is not, it's got a disparate impact on communities of color, people of color. And so for us to be able to say, let's increase the penalties and come from a punitive perspective may not necessarily be the solution. I think back to what Danielle said earlier in the presentation about if punitive justice, if that's the only justice that we had, then wouldn't there have, and if that's if the punitive justice is the only justice that we have and the most effective thing in addressing violence, then wouldn't we have seen like a decrease in violence, not a necessity of us having to build more prisons? And so I'm not necessarily sure that going the punitive route is the only route, in spite of what the data tells us and its disparate impact on communities of color, which leads to a larger conversation of all these other issues when we talk about the social determinants of public safety and this whole root of the root cause of violence as well. This whole other conversation that could be for another day, but this whole root cause of violence and crime, because some of it is based on this history, a history that unfortunately, we are seeing the realities of history of a country that has some of its foundation has been based on white supremacy. And so I know I took y'all through a bunch of tangents, but the criminal justice system isn't always the first system for us to go to address social ill wills.
I mean, well said. Certainly, Angelica hit the high lines that those are my recommendations. We often go to criminal penalties, and for someone who's spent almost 3 decades working in anti-sexual violence, the criminal penalties have not reduced the number of sexual assaults, and it certainly has not changed the trajectory of healing for sexual assault survivors. And so I liken that to be the same pathway for human trafficking survivors. Is if we only see the criminal legal system as our outlet, then we surely are not going to, one, reduce the violence and the culture of violence that still happens, and 2, we certainly are not going to move forward the needle for all survivors. And when you look at human trafficking and the datas of, and folks in the human trafficking world know for 20 years I've talked about this, is that our focus certainly when we look at human trafficking in North Carolina and across this country, the impact certainly has been on communities of color. That's who we're arresting. Those are the survivors that we are serving, because there is a certain mentality attached to the ways in which we do human trafficking, which is very criminal justice linked. And so while I do believe that there's certainly a role for the criminal legal system, I also believe that in order to really adequately ensure that human trafficking increased penalties don't continue to disproportionately impact communities of color, then we have to do the legwork first. And that's kind of the perspective is this group, your focus is to change those dynamics. And certainly I think that adds to changing the protective factors of our community, which is ultimately, for me, the real change that we have to see especially for marginalized communities.
Well, thank you. Thank you both for your contributions, your insights. And I'm going to send this back to either Natalia or to Representative Maury. We're at the finishing time, so wanted to see next steps.
So I think we have a little bit of extra time, but I also know it's already 5:45, so we don't need to use it all. But I wanted just to preview for you all kind of what is left. So we only have 2 more. The end is kind of insight. We only have 2 more scheduled meetings of this working group, which we'll have to determine whether that will be enough or not. But the next one is a week from today. We don't have any speakers. We're just going to be wrapping up some of the outstanding recommendations that we haven't fully fleshed out or come to a consensus on. So those are, we need to revisit charging decisions and prosecutorial discretion. And Jim has been working on a recommendation around ethics for prosecutors. So I'm hoping that he can walk us through that, and then we can vote on that and any other recommendations related to charging and prosecutors. We also have to do bail and pretrial. So we've heard presentations. We have a recommendation that has been sent out, and we just have 2 versions of it. And we have to decide which of those 2 versions to send to the task force. So you're welcome to weigh in on that over email, but if not, we'll just revisit it next week and decide which route to go. Then we have to touch on decriminalization, which there is also a proposal for you to react to. Anything else we want to endorse for this restorative justice conversation. We also have juvenile life without parole, which I think we've come to a consensus on, but just touching on that one more time. So that's a lot for next week, but it's all stuff that we've already talked about and come kind of close to getting to a recommendation on. And then we have one more meeting scheduled for the 10th of November. And that's where we're going to be talking about marijuana policy. And we will be hearing from 2 national experts in that space who can kind of walk us through what some of the considerations are. Any questions about that, or any ways that, as we're getting close to the end, that we can be helpful? I know it's hard to react to things on the fly, but also people are busy and don't always have a lot of time to comb through recommendations over email. So if there's ways that I can be helpful, let me know.
Thanks a lot, Natalia. And for any of our working group members, if we've missed issues that we've talked about, or you've heard with the public speaking that have happened, if you can email us and we can certainly get that in. We don't want to overlook anything any of our working group has an interest in. Natalia and I talked about this and identified what we knew were the still unresolved issues. Want to have a good meeting on the 28th. Appropriate to end it with marijuana, the last meeting, but oh well. And there are three more task force meetings, right? November 6th, the 13th, and the 18th is what we're looking at. If we need an extra work group meeting, we can do it. If we can handle what we got, let's try and do it in these next 2 meetings, if that sounds good. And I think I would also ask, just with this last topic, if Jasmine, could we get any data on the Victim Compensation Commission, what data they keep, how much there is, just so we could get a little more informed with some of the recommendations you proposed?
Sure, absolutely.
Thanks a lot.
And can I just co-sign that if there are specific victim equity related recommendations that you didn't hear see on the screen today, please let us know that as well. We're gonna, as I said, gonna be fleshing out some of the things based on the discussion, but any further guidance would be appreciated.
Any working group member have comments, or Justice Earls?
I know, I just popped in, thank you. I just wanted to say, and Angelica, you can back me up on this, but on the marijuana issue, there was a presentation by Professor Kennedy from UNC Law School today in Work Group 2's meeting, which will be up on the website soon, that I think would be really, would be useful background for you as well. And Work Group 2 was all ready to make a bunch of recommendations about legalizing all sorts of issues around drugs. So, but we told them that you're dealing with it. But I'm just, beyond the overlap issue, just the usefulness of his presentation, I would recommend to you.
Thank you so much. Any other work group members like to say anything?
Thank you all.
Great meeting. Thank you to all of our speakers, everyone hanging in, important topic, and really appreciate it. We'll see you next Wednesday. Sound good?
Bye.
Thank you.